It was never about being an entrepreneur. That buzzword has only become something I feel like since we were in college. Nobody wanted or strived to be an entrepreneur. It was more out of like a necessity to create or solve problems, and you find ways to do it yourself. I'm very much of the philosophy like you can't separate life and business. There's a lot more value that can be created outside of just spending. And so how are you smart with capital? How are you smart with your spend? People don't talk about distribution. It's amazing because like especially as tech matures, it's a slightly different game. Bilt, we're the first program that said, hey, why can't you get rewards, earn points on rent? When you want to build a loyalty program, you needed to get all the residential building owners on board. And they only want to work with you if you already have the distribution of the buildings, which is why it's so hard to get these things off the ground. I mean, people always say, like, why hasn't anyone done this before? Like, the idea is not the breakthrough here. It was getting the ecosystem together.
Ankur Jain, welcome to Change Order.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you coming. I think this is kind of like fresh off your wedding, and I think people in the office were wondering where was the honeymoon, by the way?
I was so tired at the end of the 7 days. We did like a quick 3-day Maldives thing, but I just slept the entire time, and then the third day was just back online. So I didn't. Yeah, it was a great little like 3-day thing, but we had a 7-day wedding / I feel like it was like a honeymoon with all our friends,
Were you unplugged for the whole thing, or were you
No.
working through it?
I'm very much of the philosophy like you can't separate life and business. It's all one and the same. Like my business partners are my best friends, are my business partners. My business partners are my best friends. Like it was, everyone was there. We were all having fun together, working together. It's just another part of the adventure, and that's how you know Erica's the best person to marry, is because she very knowingly walks into that, and she's equally best friends now with my business partners and their significant others, and it was a lot of fun.
It's funny you say that because I feel like a lot of the most successful people I've met say the most important decision of your business career is who you end up marrying.
It really is amazing. Like and Erica has just been such a great partner since day one. I mean, I always joke like, in doing these business deals, sometimes I feel like even if they hate me, they'll still love her. So they'll still want to hang out. And she's such a great sport. She comes to all the dinners with me. We travel together. It's just like, and she's in such a different world in fitness that like a lot of the people we work with are just as excited to find cool things to do with her and vice versa. So
that's awesome. I want to take a step back. You were born and raised in Seattle. You're dad immigrated here to the U.S. and has been a seemingly serial entrepreneur, I would probably call it.
Yeah.
What was it like growing up in your household and growing up in Seattle during the rise of tech?
Well, first you got to get the backstory, right? So I mean, I am so thankful to have been born here in the U.S. I mean, my dad grew up in a very poor village in India. My mom was born in India, but grew up in Israel her whole life. Her father was part of the United Nations peacekeeping force. And so, I could have easily been, born in a village in India. And when they came here, my mom came here for college. My dad came here after college. Like, it's like the story you hear a lot from immigrants. They came here with nothing. And a lot of that immigrant DNA is just, it's hard to replicate. And it's something actually Eric and I talk about a lot actually now. But just to give you some context, like before I was born, my parents had moved to California. They were living in a 1-bedroom apartment with another couple. And when they got married in the late 80s, my dad couldn't afford a honeymoon. And so you were talking about where I went. I was very lucky. They couldn't afford a honeymoon, and so he came up with this crazy idea. He goes, "If I send my resume to 20 companies, one of them will have to fly us out for an interview, and that'll become the honeymoon destination." And so he did. And this like startup in Seattle called Microsoft was one of the companies that said, "Come out for an interview." And so he told my mom, he goes, "Hey, honey, we're going to do our honeymoon in Seattle."
Oh my gosh.
And that's how they ended up, obviously, long story short, in Seattle. And then he was just like, that same hustle was just part of every day growing up. I mean, I remember when we were I was 6 years old or 5 years old. And I mean, my dad, I remember he's just starting to make some like ability to like take care of the family. We were living like pretty deep suburbs, like, outside of Redmond, Washington. And he comes home one day and he tells my mom, and I'm overhearing everything, that he's going to quit his job to start a company. And I remember that was one of the biggest fights I remember witnessing in my parents. I mean, she's thinking to herself, like, we finally have like some stability under our feet, and you're going to quit? Like, what is wrong with you? But that began like a pretty key moment in our family that changed my life. Right. I mean, and so in 96, he left and he started his company, InfoSpace, and that grew to be a $40 billion .com company. But for us, my brother, sister, and I, it was our everyday life. I mean, every day after school, we would just get dropped off at the office.
Really?
My mom worked with him on the company, so they were working together. We would get dropped off after school. I would sit there, I'd play video games, do my homework, and then just sit in on meetings.
That's wild.
And it totally, you cannot replicate that exposure and that experience.
I do wonder if your dad bringing you to the office and you seeing him and your mom working ultimately helped instill that in you, because my parents and my aunts and uncles were all entrepreneurs as well.
Yeah.
And so like work ethic was just like, oh, I saw my dad leave at 5 a.m. and he came back to coach our sports teams at 4.
Right.
But there are a lot of people who grow up with parents who are successful or hardworking, but they don't get to witness it firsthand.
Yeah, I think that's always like a crazy concept to me. Like, it is the greatest gift you can give your family is exposure and learning and education. And it doesn't have to be the extreme necessarily that maybe we had of going to the office every day after school. But there's something really about passing on that skill set, that knowledge. And honestly, it's exposure, right? And it's funny, right? Because as we study more and more of how the brain works and how, I mean, now with AI, everyone's talking about what is similar and what is different from the human brain. But at the end of the day, the information we're exposed to builds those reference points that we use for pattern matching and everything else we do. And so if you grow up and you're able to be exposed to a world where when people say no, the pattern is that there's still a way to figure it out. It's very different than growing up in a world where, you have a box that you follow on every single thing. And it's funny, Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this in a slightly different way when he wrote that Outliers book, if you remember. And, his hypothesis is that one of the biggest drivers of socioeconomic impact from growing up in that household is, obviously there's access, but a lot of it is also the mindset that these kids have from a young age of being willing and able to question things. And that's something that, I'm very privileged and lucky to have. And I think if we can have more people get access and exposure to these types of different careers and different skills and different pathways from a younger age, I think it actually has a pretty significant impact.
I'm totally aligned with you. I mean, I think my life journey has ultimately been the intersection of like what I learned from my parents, which was ultimately work ethic.
Yep.
But then also seeing the rise of technology when I was a kid and all the opportunities that it might end up presenting itself. And for you, it sounded like there was kind of something similar. It sounds like there was a commercial for Jump Souls or something that you saw that led you to some of this.
So this was a funny. So it was, to be clear, it was never about being an entrepreneur. Like, that buzzword has only become something I feel like since we were in college, right? There was nobody wanted or strived to be an entrepreneur.
Yep.
Like at this time when I was growing up, at least, right? And so it was more out of like a necessity to create or solve problems, and you find ways to do it yourself. And so, as a kid growing up, I had entrepreneurial parents, but also immigrant families, right? So you understand, like, one of the biggest fights I had with my parents as a kid was like when I wanted to go play sports at school. I mean, just even to start, when I bought like my pair of basketball shoes and they saw that it was $65, like that battle to them, it was like, to my dad growing up, he's like, well, why do you need expensive shoes like that? It's just, that's how it was. I mean, he's coming from a very different place. And so I remember when I was a skinny, scrawny Indian kid, 7th grade, trying to make the basketball team. And I was by all measures not the first pick for the team. And then I saw this ad on TV, like you were saying, for this thing called Jump Soles. And it was like this ad of some kid being able to jump up and grab the rim because he had these plyometric shoes. And I was thinking, God, if I could
weighted ones?
The weighted like
I remember
plyometric.
on the toe, yes.
I was like, God, if I got those and I could dunk the ball one day, like they'll have to put me on the team. And so I was like asking my mom, asking my dad, like begging them to buy these things, like $130 or something. And they just like refused to do it. And at the time I had been coding and I had a website up and running, and I had started to see how people were getting paid for ads on their sites. And so I had this crazy idea, and I went to their website, found the customer service phone number, and I was 11 years old, and I just kept calling it, asking to speak to the CEO. Because I figured like that's what I had seen. You just call and you try to do a deal. You cold call. And somebody, like, I don't know how or why, because I was definitely prepubescent, like squeaky voice. They put me on the phone with the CEO of this company that manufactures jump soles. And I pitched them on, I think your product is so great for young people. And I'll run an ad on our website. If don't have to pay me, just send me a pair. And 2 weeks later, they sent me a box of jump soles. And my mom, first she's like, where did you buy this? Where did this come from? And anyways, it was one of the first big wins that I had as an entrepreneur.
That's amazing.
And it was my first like business deal. I still didn't make the basketball team, but it was the beginning of that entrepreneurial journey. When you realize you can create these win-win opportunities that create economic value, right? That became the key. And it's funny, like that was actually the biggest thing I would say growing up was outside of exposure. You know, my parents had this philosophy. It came to education or health, there was no expense to be spared. Everything else was frivolous. What that ended up being is like to get the stuff we wanted, even at home, you had to get creative and find ways to like, you know, create these win-win opportunities to get it yourself.
How does that impact the way you think about spending now, both from a company perspective and then in your personal life?
I mean, I'm definitely willing to buy the $65 shoes today. I think it's one of the most dangerous things that startups do is early in their business, you know, venture capitalists will throw money at them. And all of a sudden, especially if it's your first time with that, you start spending so much more freely before you actually have the right, you know, foundation to know where to invest, right? But I think this mindset of there's a lot more value that can be created outside of just spending, right? And so how are you smart with capital? How are you smart with your spend? And everything just becomes justifiable as a future thing, right? And so, you know, look at Bilt, like we've taken a very different approach. Like we did not raise any traditional venture capital money into the business until we were basically profitable. And so instead, what we did is we used equity and capital raising as part of a lever to do bigger business deals. And so back to this idea of saying, how can you create a win-win-win? I think one of the things that's so underspoken about in startups, people talk about what's the market you're going after. They talk about, do you have product market fit? People don't talk about distribution.
Very, right? Very important.
And it's amazing because like, especially as tech matures and, you know, if you're working outside of a breakthrough technology, or like if you're working in, you know, cutting edge AI, it's a slightly different game. Distribution still matters, but slightly different game. The rest of the technology market has become a little more mature. And so you win on distribution, right? And one of the things that we really took to heart in starting this company is we said, how do we use capital raising and equity as part of distribution deals?
Smart.
And so we raised all of our capital in the early days from our core partners on the real estate side. And that allowed us to have really long-term aligned interests, which also meant that we had much less capital in the bank to start. And so we were really disciplined about how we spent it. But there was never pressure from our investors to try to race to the next round. the pressure from our investors was create the best product that I can use because I need it for my distribution, like their solution. And that alignment of interests across the board, I mean, it goes back to the very first thing, like everything's about aligning interests.
Yeah, we talk a lot about how first-time founders think a lot about product and not a lot about distribution, but second-time founders think more about distribution than they do about product. It sounds like you've found the nice, healthy balance between both. Yeah, it's interesting though, because I look back at the way that you capitalize your business, and then Luke Schoenfelder at Latch did the exact same thing. He got major real estate, owners on the cap table. And especially in the real estate world, it feels like one of those things where it's keeping up with the Joneses. If you can get, one or two dominoes to move, all of a sudden the rest of the market falls. Is that what you experienced?
So let's start with Bilt, as you know, is the loyalty program for your home and neighborhood, right? We're the first program that said, hey, why can't you get rewards, earn points on rent? It's your biggest expense every month. Why can't you earn points on your biggest expense? That has grown from the loyalty program at home into now your loyalty program for your home and neighborhood, right? So you now get rewarded not just where you live at home, but also at your favorite local restaurants and local fitness studios and local grocery and coffee shops, and staying loyal to the neighborhood, right? To get that off the ground, though, is tricky. And it's one of these things where you have this cold start issue where when you want to build a loyalty program, we needed to get all the residential building owners on board.
Yeah.
But they only want to get on board if you also have the merchants who are funding some of the rewards around you, who only want to use your program if you have the rewards value, which requires the airlines and the hotels and the Amazons and everyone to play ball. And they only want to work with you if you already have the distribution of the buildings. And so you get this little nobody wants to talk to you problem, which is why it's so hard to get these things off the ground. Right? I mean, people always say, why hasn't anyone done this before? The idea is not the breakthrough here.
Yep.
Right? It was getting the ecosystem together. Now, even that isn't as easy as getting a distribution deal with a couple real estate owners, because you still need multiple. You need 2 out of the 3 at least to hit. Right? And so what happened for us is we spent all of 2018, all of 2019 pitching this model, building it, trying to get some early traction. And honestly, we really struggled. People said, love the idea, but come back to me when you have this. Come back to me when you have, and it was just this constant pass along. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we get one of these or 2 of these locked in? And then COVID happened, right? And all of a sudden the world broke. And for the first time everybody was willing to try something new, all at the same weirdly condensed period of time. And so right when that was happening, I remember March, April 2020, I was starting to get phone calls from a couple of the real estate guys saying, hey, are you still working on that loyalty program concept? Because we need to find a new way to get people to both pay rent on time and sign leases. Because right now we're giving out 3-month concessions, which we've never done before.
Interesting.
Right? And you had airlines, the first couple started to call us back and say, business travel just got shot. We don't know if that's ever going to come back. We don't even know if consumer travel will come back. But if anybody's going to start flying, it's probably younger people. If anyone's going to get back on planes, are you still working on that loyalty program for renters? And the first couple merchants started saying, hey, we got to figure out a new model here. Local is probably our best bet. Can we reach people in buildings? Are you still working on that loyalty program?
Yeah.
And you got to have the right idea, but you've got to get really lucky. And that moment that everything broke opened the door to getting the first couple in each of these stakeholder groups. And that then began the flywheel.
So with your business, as you mentioned, you have local merchants, you have national merchants like airlines, you have real estate owners who are probably great distribution partners, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of consumer fintechs that were dying around you as you guys were starting to scale up because they couldn't figure out their CAC. But the graveyard of companies that tried doing pay for your rent with your card is vast, going back to when you and I first started getting into venture and startups. How the heck did you go to Wells Fargo and get something done with them? Did you cold call them like you were 11 again, or what was the process?
So first of all, to take a step back, don't forget, the card part of our business is a fairly small part of our business, right? But it's a super exciting, innovative space, right? And so if you look at loyalty programs today, like airline programs, hotel programs, the nice thing is there's already a great model for this, right? And so United Airlines has a co-brand card with Chase Bank. Delta has a co-brand card with American Express. So for us, the biggest challenge was actually figuring out how to build a loyalty program around the home first. Because then it's a model that any bank will plug into, right? And so business opportunity is not necessarily in just payments. It's in the loyalty. And so our business is built between residential buildings and merchants, right? And it's loyalty for the buildings, right? To drive, taking all that cost that comes from leasing, renewals, et cetera, and having a loyalty program around that. And it's for merchants to be able to reach these local customers. When you have that ecosystem, banks understand that model. They partner and bid on loyalty program, co-brands all the time, right? And so for us, that was how we pitched it. And we went and met with different banks and we said, there's a really unique distribution channel, right? We became the distribution channel to reach young, up and coming customers who are professionals renting in these apartment buildings all across the United States. And we have a rewards currency that we've built. That's the Bilt points, right? And there's a great unique co-brand opportunity in a whole new white space. No different than what you've done in airlines and hotels so successfully.
Did you guys go, though, to them once you had built both of those? So you were like, hey, we have the owners and we already have the merchants?
Yeah, so we went to them when we had the points currency and the real estate owners.
Got it.
We were still building out the merchant side, but we went to them. It was literally the first pitch deck was, here's the airline programs, here's the customer profile, here's the hotel programs, here's the real estate base, and here are our initial real estate partners. Here's the initial points currency we're building. And one of the exciting things that we had done was, as our point currency, we said, hey, for airlines, you earn points so that you can fly around the country, but so one day you can fly to the Maldives, right? We said for your loyalty program for home, you want to use points for travel and spend, but one day you also want to buy a home, right? And so we had spent 18 months working with the regulators and working with FHA and FHFA and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And we had actually gotten approval in October of 2019 before we had actually done any of the bank stuff.
Wow.
To use Bilt points towards a down payment. So when we talked to these banks, we said, not only does this look like an airline or hotel program, but it's a younger audience. It's a totally new category of growth. And we have points that can be used towards a mortgage. So as a partner of ours, not only can you access on a co-brand partner, but as our customers kind of grow in their life cycle, you can also build a relationship with them for mortgage.
So it's really enticing LTV for them.
Totally. And that's how we were lucky to have one of the big four banks partner with us in a long-term way on that side of the business.
It's fascinating. Did you, when you were going out and building the merchant program, were you sitting on top of other infrastructure to start, or?
That's right. So always. So again, we spent a lot of time. This was one of the bigger challenges we had to build a solution to, but we sit on top of the payment networks, right? So if you think of Visa, MasterCard, American Express, they do payment acceptance. We are a network on top of that between properties and merchants. And so we work closely with all three networks. We leverage the kind of capabilities we've built plus what they've built to create a better experience for the merchant. So the merchant can accept the payment the same way. There's no like, scan this QR code or, go awkwardly to the bar and be like, oh, I live down at the street. I think I had a discount or a 2x points. I mean, imagine you're on a date at a restaurant. No one wants to be that person being like, oh, I live at, Related. I think I have a extra reward that I get here.
Date over.
And so being able to automate all that with the payment networks to be able to drive more spend to local merchants, create more value for the consumers, and in the process also more value for our buildings, right? Required a lot of collaboration with those guys.
It's kind of amazing all the infrastructure that's been built out over the last 10 years, no pun intended, that all these companies can kind of build on top of. Otherwise, if this was years ago, you would have had to build out a massive engineering and risk team, a massive sales team to go acquire all those merchants, and get into their rewards. And now, you rode the rails of what exists today.
100%. Timing is everything. And once you have, it's both the rails, but also the industry understanding of it, right? So like there were a lot of people who had to go into prop tech and fail for us to have a chance at coming in and pitching them something innovative like this.
Yeah.
Right. And so if there hadn't been that history, a lot of these owners may not have been thinking about, how do I even think about integrations into my system? That wasn't a concept before, right? And the property management software companies may not have had such a robust API set to tap into. That doesn't mean that there wasn't a ton we had to figure out still, but you're starting on a much more modern base.
Makes a lot of sense. I look back at your company. So like Human, I was watching this morning a launch advertisement, I think with Sophia Bush, and know you had Richard Branson as a beta user there. And then, with this business, you've got a big Wells Fargo deal out of the gates. I mean, how do you approach these big deals, getting, incredible people to do things that maybe they never would have thought they would have done?
So it's funny, right? It kind of goes back to, as a startup, your biggest asset is not your scale yet. It's definitely not cash, right? It's kind of like growing up. You don't have the allowance or cash to spend. You definitely don't have the adult stature and status. So how do you think about creating new, different value props and win-win-wins, right? And I think sometimes people they try to fake it, and that actually doesn't work. You got to lean into your strengths, right? And so when you're talking to these big guys, what do we have that they don't, and what do they have that we want? And so, again, when you look at Wells, what we were able to do is go to a market like real estate owners that had no kind of technology loyalty program, say, we can bring that to you. And there's no point in trying to build the tech yourself. That's not your business, right? Which they get. Then when you have that combined with a customer demo that we can say we understand particularly well because we are the customer, right? And you bring that to a big bank, we actually are the best partner, not a compromise partner. We are the best partner for that use case. They are the best partner for this other use case, right? And so if we went in kind of trying to pitch ourselves as some big player up front, we would have never worked. Right? You have to have you have to lean into what makes you different and better as a startup. And that changes as you grow. As you grow, now we are the biggest distribution channel into residential buildings across the United States. So we can lean into a very different value prop that we offer people like merchants, right? And we are the biggest merchant of record on rental spend. So we can work with banks and payment networks to help drive, if you want to set the piece of that $700 billion a year spent on rent,
It's a lot.
we are the best partner to help you acquire that. And so you may have seen, we work now with Bank of America, and they said, hey, how can we also tap into this $700 billion a year of rent spend? And so we partnered with them and we launched a benefit because we're a platform where if you use your Bank of America, Alaska Airlines card on rental payments, you now get 3x miles on that, right? And so we become a platform where banks and networks and whether it's debit or credit can create their own rewards and value prop through Bilt for their customers when they choose to pay their rent with that debit card or that credit card. And there's so much white space there, which now we represent.
I'm curious because as I hear you speak, and I've spoken to a bunch of our mutual friends about you and learned a lot about you, what would you say your superpower is?
I don't know if I have any, but it's I'd say what I spend a lot of my time trying to just do as a founder is really focus on, again, someone said to me once, the best innovation is not about thinking outside the box, right? Because outside the box inherently tends to imply incrementally further out from what's already been done, and there's so much depth and expertise. Often the best innovation happens from thinking about the problem from a different box, right? And I'd say where our strength, and this is why Bilt has been one of the most fun businesses for me to work on, is I'd say it's the ability to identify the arbitrage and opportunity in totally different markets because there's so much inefficiency, right? And so if you say to somebody, hey, look, hold on, there's a category of travel companies like airlines and hotels whose business it is to help their members earn miles from different categories of spend. I mean, Delta makes $7 billion a year from their American Express deal.
It's a payments company.
Right? And you say to them, let me help you tap into this new category for people to earn miles on. And then you can go to the airline guys, or the property guys, and you can go to the property guys and say, hey, we have a way to help your customers earn airline miles, right? Those two worlds don't generally intersect. And the ability to actually execute and implement a seamless integrated solution is not the core skill set for either of them, right? And that's where there's a lot of opportunity. And I would say as we continue to think about this and as our network and platform grows, our ability to provide capabilities that connect different worlds continues to grow, right? And so whether it's now being able to plug and play for Bank of America to come in and offer benefits to now drive more of that spend on their card, or whether it's a merchant that says, I want a way to easily target, let's take like a fitness studio like SoulCycle. I want to be able to say to every new resident who moves into the neighborhood that if they've never taken SoulCycle before, they get a complimentary class. And I want to be able to manage that at scale and use that as a core part of our loyalty and marketing. We're the only player that can do that because everybody who moves into these local buildings signs up for Bilt to pay their rent. We have the APIs both with the buildings and with SoulCycle to be able to identify if that customer has been a SoulCycle customer before, to issue them a credit to book a free class, and then to have that tracking all the way through. So now you move in, you get a new benefit, property benefits from some of the revenue share they get from our merchant partners and us, SoulCycle benefits because they're reaching new customers seamlessly, and the customer feels like, God, I'm getting a lot of value in my neighborhood by being part of this program.
It's a fascinating network effect for the business where it's as if your moats are getting stronger and stronger over time, but so is your product, it feels like.
Well, I think it's one and the same.
Yeah.
Right. And so as long as you keep the customer at the center, there's so much value that can be created for everybody. Because at the end of the day, this is why I love B2C. Like I struggle with B2B businesses because you don't always win on the best product. Right? B2B, there's so many reasons why people pick one thing over the other. It's change management, it's legacy relationships, it's price, it's all sorts of issues. On the customer side, for the most part, if you can reach them, all things being equal, they will pick the better product.
It's true.
Right? And so if we can become the experts on the members, the consumers, there's so much value we can create for the properties and for the merchants. And it's funny because one of our best partners is Equity Residential. And I was talking to David Deere, who runs a lot of their operations and technology, and he goes, the reason Bilt in his mind has been so successful for them is because we were probably the first prop tech company that came in, not actually pitching Equity Residential, but telling Equity Residential, here's a way you can build a better relationship with your residents and monetize it. Right. And so, and his joke was that if we spent all our time just pitching real estate owners, we may have ended up building so many things that would have made the experience so clunky for the customer that it may not have ever worked in the first place for what the real estate owners actually wanted anyways.
It actually feels like to me, maybe your superpower is like you have a very good worldview of different companies and different markets and different business models that work. But more importantly, you have a very good understanding of the different chess pieces on the board and what their incentives are at the end of the day and how to make it a win-win-win for everyone.
I think that's part of the exciting thing of doing this business, right? And it gets the really exciting stuff is now that it's even more complex of a network, creating value props where you can really create wins all around, right, is really exciting.
How do you take that skill that you just mentioned, especially in your partnership dealings, into your job as a CEO and managing people and trying to get the most out of people?
So we have a different way of building this business than I think maybe I had in my past companies. Historically, as you grow the business, you have your engineering organization, your marketing organization, your sales organization. And what ends up happening is you start to get this internal politics between the groups. And so you start to hear things like, well, Eng isn't giving us resources. And Eng going, well, product is throwing too many things at us and they're not giving us prioritization, or they're not giving us time to work on bugs, or we have to work on this project for this team, so we don't have resources to work on this project for the marketing team, right? The minute that starts to happen, like, you're dead. Right? And it's scary to me, having gone through this now and seeing some of like the smartest entrepreneurs that I know deal with this, where now, like, no matter what they try to instill that startup culture still, as these big companies, like, it is shocking to me how many big technology companies operate like a government bureaucracy these days. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And like, these are tech startups,
Yeah.
right? And so to be proven, but the way that we have set up Bilt, kind of learning from that at my past businesses, is this time around we moved into more of a pod model. And so our company is set up as independent, almost little startups within the business. And so like our neighborhood rewards platform, which is what our merchants use to reach our customers, runs with a self-contained team where they have their own backend of 5 to 6 backend engineers, 2 to 3 front-end engineers, a product designer, technical product manager, a product marketer, a GM. They work together super closely. They win together. There's such priorities are set within that team. They're never competing with others. And what that's allowed us to do is, one, keep that startup culture and energy at every part of our business, right? So our resident loyalty platform team is different than our neighborhood rewards team. But again, fully independent in their ability to execute with cross-functional kind of standards and leadership.
Yeah.
But what's also cool about it is it also becomes a forcing function for, are you becoming too bloated or too big? And so we cap the number of engineers per pod. We cap the team resources per pod. And if it ever becomes that somebody says, I have too much to get done and I can't prioritize it, it forces the question, is one of your business lines so big now and worth investing in an entirely new pod where the hurdle isn't just like hire a couple more engineers? It's, I have to commit to then hiring an entirely new team, which sets the standard high and forces people to say, am I just not prioritizing well? Or is this that big of a play? And so, for example, like this happened recently where our payments business has now had to split off from our resident loyalty business because there is so much we are doing to build campaign modules for properties so they can run new lease campaigns and new move-in campaigns and resident retention campaigns, versus our payments business where we're doing tens of billions of dollars a year of payments through it now, and supporting all these new platform capabilities for banks and networks to engage with it, that now it's 2 separate teams. And they have their own engineering, their own product design, their own marketing teams, and everything moves at the speed of a startup the way we did 4 years ago.
It's a lot like DoorDash. They have a very similar structure, I think.
Do they?
From what I've heard. Yeah. And I'm curious, though, when they want to expand their pod, or as you think about resource allocation, how do you ultimately get more resources for your pod to grow versus somebody else's pod?
Well, that's the point, is it's a full team that you have yourself. So, and by capping the team size, there isn't just, I want to keep, I think that is one area, because a bunch of my buddies at DoorDash who have the GM model, they're still running multi-100 person teams.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is you just lose that startup culture when you do that.
So you're basically thinking, okay, 5 years from now, we're going to go from X number of pods to Y number of pods, but you're going to keep it constrained as much as you can.
Yeah, and ideally you don't have to, because if you're doing a good job of picking the right business lines, and again, like one of my other favorite quotes, actually something my dad used to say to me forever, he goes, great companies die from indigestion, not starvation.
Yeah.
They just start saying yes to everything, and they stop focusing on the key things that matter. And a good business model is actually a really simple business model.
Warren Buffett.
Right? And so for us, like, I want to keep this simple. Like, we have a two-sided network. We have properties, homes, and we have merchants. How do I create a neighborhood loyalty platform for merchants? How do I create a resident loyalty program for properties? And all the spend that's driven at either of those two ecosystems, how do I keep a percent of it? And that's it.
Do you find yourself in meetings then, like, pausing everybody? Because I feel like it's natural when you have a lot of smart people in the room that they're going to get super intellectual and pull you in different directions. And then do you just find yourself dialing it back in?
So yes, but also I think we're pretty ruthless about the people we hired. Like, I don't like to hire MBAs. MBAs love to pontificate and like put up their like whatever, and God bless them, and they should go work at, wherever corporate hires them. I just think that as a startup, you need people who are scrappy, who want to get things done. And if you can give them the right environment to excel, like, they have no shortage of stuff to do. And if they have so much time in the day that they're worrying about like these hypothetical giant opportunities, like, we should really be asking ourselves why we have that as a pod.
Yeah.
Totally
fair. And I did read a little bit around like the fastest way to get fired at Bilt is that you say something's not possible.
Yes.
So how do you breed a culture where people think that everything's possible?
Well, one, you do it by example, right? Like, as part of this culture, you have to keep showing people how to create. Everything is doable. It's just a matter of like cost and rewards and alignment of incentives. And like, is it worth it to somebody or is it not worth it to somebody? And that's it. Like, it's not that it's not possible, right? And so, number one is you just have to be ruthless about instilling that culture. Like, we are not the company for everybody, and not everybody's the right person for Bilt, right? But when you're at Bilt, you should feel very clear on what you own, right? So like, one of the things we do as part of the pod model is every single person across the business should be able to clearly articulate what part of our business platform succeeds or dies with them, period. You own the backend engineering for the transaction monitoring that happens, period. There's not a team of 10 people that do that, right? You have 1 to 2 people max.
Real responsibility.
Right. You own that. Now, that creates some risk, but I think it also attracts the best talent, because the best talent wants to to know what they're responsible for every single day, right? We're a 5-day-a-week in-person office.
Love
the teams
that.
all sit together. We've been that way since the beginning of 2021, right? These guys sit together. They know what they own. They work together across their team. And then whenever there's an issue, like, they know they're responsible for solving it. It's not a like, hope my boss figures this out, right? Because at the end of the day, we can pinpoint who owns what, right? So you combine that with a culture of saying not possible is not an acceptable answer, and you attract a certain type of person who's a figure it out type mentality.
How do you really suss out resourcefulness during the interview process or a culture fit for Bilt?
It's a great question. I have to give full credit to our teams on this. It is probably a little different than most startups where a lot of people talk about founders being involved in all the interview. I have moved a lot of that decision making to our GMs of every pod. And so you'll notice some slight personality type differences between the pods, but they really drive the hiring. But they also know that if someone doesn't match the culture and sits in my product review meeting, they're probably not going to, be the right person for Bilt long term, right? And so it starts to attract the right kind of intellectual curiosity, the right ownership. Again, it's an ownership mentality. That's what I care about.
Yeah.
Does someone want to come in and own something, or do they not?
Yeah. The former head of the CIA, George Tenet, once said to us, you want to bring people in that are owners, not renters.
I like that.
Yeah. For Bilt, it's good to have renters, but for your company, you probably want owners.
Yeah. Well, we want to reward our renters with ownership.
Exactly. It's interesting to hear you speak, because I think there's a lot of really good leadership principles in what you're talking about. And my understanding is, maybe it was after high school or college, you worked for the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff's head. And he was potentially one of the best, if not the best leaders that you've ever met in your life. What were some of the principles that you learned from him?
So I was very fortunate. One of my mentors was, as you mentioned, Admiral Owens, who ran the U.S. military and was commander of the Second Fleet in the Navy, and then kind of took over as vice chair of the Joint Chiefs. And I moved with him to Hong Kong after high school.
Wow.
And had the opportunity to really shadow him and support on kind of the efforts he was doing on U.S.-China relations, and what we can do to bring these countries together at a time really trying to avoid some of the tension that we're seeing today.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of stuff he shared with me that still sticks with me to this day, right? I think one of the things that I always found fascinating, so he took me early on to a meeting in Beijing. We went into this place called the Lotus Palace. It's a restaurant now, but it's a historical spot in Beijing. And we sat in that room with the admiral, the author of the 5-year plan for the Chinese Communist Party, and his chief of staff, a translator, and a historian. And this was one of the lessons that the admiral brought me along specifically to see, is he said, you look at the Chinese government, and this is something he said we could learn from their approach. He says, one, they're looking to think in 5 to 10 year increments in terms of the vision. But also, it's so easy. We forget, you talk about history repeats itself. We make the same mistake over and over again. Mm-hmm. It's especially true at a startup, by the way. If not thoughtful, it's easy to make those mistakes, and that's what can kill a startup. In that meeting in China, they had a historian in the room to be able to bring back, like, not just what we were talking about, but contextual examples of this throughout the past to factor into the 5-year plan. That stuck with me in such a unique, powerful way. And it was interesting because they were talking in that meeting about Chinese investment around the world and how they can be a player. And we spent most of the conversation with them asking the admiral the mistakes and learnings from the Marshall Plan after World War II, where the U.S. government issued aid to a lot of Eastern Europe post-World War II to rebuild, and soon, or after World War I, I think, World War II, sorry. And soon after, a lot of that still became under communist rule, even though we had spent so much in supporting that fight, for the Eastern Europeans. And the Chinese, in that meeting, were asking all the questions to the admiral, and you look a few years later, they rolled out the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yep.
Which was a massive international investment plan that was so clearly, whether you agree with it or not, from their perspective, learnings from what did and didn't work, not in their history, but in our history.
Yep.
And so with all the investments they made in Africa, again, right or wrong, they took the approach of saying, well, we're also going to have certain contractual rights to using the ports or for trade or for participating in the development in these areas, right? It's fascinating. And at a startup, there's so many learnings, not just from your own team, but from all the companies before us. And it just doesn't get brought up enough. So that is something we spend a lot of time looking at as a business. We look at what are the distribution models? What can you learn from how Microsoft did distribution with the IBMs and Dells of the world versus Apple and what didn't work? And then, by the way, like, what flipped Apple when they suddenly said, when they're selling the iPhone, they did that famous SoftBank deal, right, to do distribution deals with Masa, to do distributions with Hero. I think Singular was their first distribution partner here in the US. They had never sold that way.
It really is the case, though, where I feel like the best founders are the ones who study history time and time again.
It's really fascinating. And I mean, by the way, especially for the other, like, to understand the history of these other businesses you're working with.
Yeah.
A lot of what inspires us at Bilt is the creation of Visa, MasterCard, American Express. I mean, I'm so lucky that my partner in this business is Ken Chenault, who was the CEO of American Express for a long time. And I remember, like, we go to, regular, he works with us 7 days a week, which is just the level of in the weeds he is has been the most amazing learning experience I've ever had. But you hear the stories of when they were first building American Express's network for the consumer side. Like, they were AMEX has gone through a lot of evolutions over the century, right? And traveler's checks to then, corporate cards to then, Ken's claim to fame was launching membership rewards. And it was so interesting because I remember like a year ago, he was telling me the story of as they were building their merchant network, it's almost again, history repeats itself. Like I was explaining how we were starting in the restaurant space because it was super hyper local and it felt like the easiest way to create value between buildings and restaurants. And then Ken started telling me that that's where they started. And they literally went and they looked at Diners Club and said, we could take American Express, tell restaurants it's like a house account model. And back then you would present your Amex card and they would literally call a bank at the American Express headquarters, wow, read off the authorization and get a real-time authorization over the phone.
No way.
And then submit a bill to American Express. I mean, but he would tell me these stories of how they would go around the neighborhoods and they would find the like hottest restaurants on every block. And they would start by signing those people up. And then they would go to the local ones after that. And they would say, well, these guys are part of this program and accept American Express. And they would slowly, and then they started partnering with these resellers that they call ISOs, the independent sales orgs, and how that became this powerful amplification skill. And so we use that to create the model where our properties can now act as essentially ISOs or resellers to local merchants. And so for us to have boots on the ground in every neighborhood would be extraordinarily hard. But if you look at the history of Amex or even Visa, they would partner with these local merchant acquirers and local ISOs. And here we have these local buildings who are economically incentivized to grow this network because they participate in the revenue. They have people on the ground who know the best local coffee shops, the best local restaurants, et cetera. They're meeting with these restaurant owners because the restaurant owners are coming to the building saying, hey, can we put up a flyer in your building? And we enable them to really simply onboard those places into the neighborhood rewards platform. The merchant wins, the building generates more revenue, and we actually structured an economic model almost entirely inspired by what the networks did, where now these people who sign up local merchants, not only do they earn on revenue from their own residents, but we let them share in revenue from any resident spend at that merchant. So there's also a little bit of a race to be the first to sign up the different merchants, but everybody wins.
Again, going back to incentives, you understand the incentives of all the players in the ecosystem.
And but a lot of this, again, is taking the models from industries where you see this already working and bringing it into our industry.
I think about that with our portfolio and that model of Amex. Our portfolio company Slice, they're going out and they're signing pizza shops. And whenever they land in a market, they're getting the biggest, baddest pizza shop in town or in that local market. And then everybody else comes on with them.
So we probably will have announced this by then, but like we are becoming a huge partner of Slice, right?
There you go.
Cut this out if it's not live by then, but like same concept. We look at what they're doing as a really great platform they're building for these local pizza merchants. Ultimately, though, the best way to drive value for their platform outside of all the capabilities they're creating is to also aggregate demand for those merchants.
Totally.
So we're going to become a deep partnership. We're launching a deep partnership with Bilt and Slice, where we are going to power a neighborhood pizza rewards through Slice for all of our local residents. And even cooler, through the APIs, buildings will now be able to actually invest in benefits. Like when you move in, they can automate a welcome free cheese pizza that then gives you a credit in your Bilt Rewards app, which then you can use to redeem for a free slice of pizza that's then passed to the merchant through Slice. And the merchant's now tapping into not only through Slice a whole population of local customers, but entirely new spend pools from like building, marketing, and all these areas that they otherwise couldn't have reached.
I love that. I want to like take one step back. So you had mentioned you were living in China, and that for that summer, and you learned a lot about history, which I think or the importance of history, which I think if you study Xi Jinping, like he talks a lot about not only 5 or 10 years, he's talking like 100 years out, and he can really regurgitate history in an incredible way. With your experience in China, I think you also had dinner with Jack Ma. Was that what you got from him? Was it a similar learning, or was there other things?
So this was a different experience. We had to sit down with the CEO of Alibaba.com, David Wei at the time. And Alibaba was still in the process of entering the United States. This was a big, exciting growth area for them. And so they reached out, and I got a chance to connect to them. They wanted to reach with young entrepreneurs. I was in college at the time. And they wanted to reach with young entrepreneurs to say, what would make you use Alibaba for your small business or your business growth? And as part of that, I did a trip to China where I got to sit down with the executives and leadership of Alibaba, which was the most fascinating experience I had. One, it was the first time I'd really seen the breadth of the tech startup, if you will, in China, because my previous experience with the Admiral was a little bit more on the government side. And aside from the fact that I remember vividly, this is 2008, 2009, there was a giant lobby room with a dashboard that had real-time data streaming, which we still barely have at a lot of our tech companies here, of every order being placed on Taobao and through Alipay and through Alibaba, showing up and all over the map. I mean, it was crazy. People had no idea. We were hearing about Alibaba in the US, how big it was. And he was explaining to me that when they first launched Taobao, which is their Amazon meets eBay, if you will, eBay had already entered China. And eBay was the market leader in China. And going after a company like eBay sounded crazy. And there was two things that they said to me that were fascinating. He said, it goes back to understanding if your startup is truly in a new technology category or if you're in a market. He said, when we were launching Taobao and looking at eBay, the first thing we said is, sure, eBay has 80-90% market share of the current internet users here in China. He goes, but we're adding 10 to 20 million new internet users every single month. And we're going to own 90% of the market share of those users. Right? So when you talk about pioneering technologies, it's a different game, right? Once you look at a lot of stuff that's happening in AI, it doesn't matter if OpenAI has 80-90% market share today if they're not capturing that market share on the next 5 million users, 10 million users every single month, right? So it's an interesting, different game. And so they became the best at new person to the internet, number one. And two, he said, the biggest thing that they had learned was, he said, every one of the startups that they had seen kept worrying about what their competitor was doing. He said, every venture capital company that came to them kept asking them, well, what are you going to do about eBay? How are you going to compete with eBay? What does eBay do? And he goes, our philosophy was, I don't spend any time thinking about my competitor. I obsess over the customer. And if my competitor ever starts doing anything that's relevant, my customer is going to ask me why I'm not doing it. And he goes, that's when I know to invest in it, because otherwise I'm spending my entire time benchmarking to what the market is doing, not to what the customer needs. And I see this, but this is a big reason I left Silicon Valley, because it doesn't matter how smart you are, how experienced you are, inevitably you're in an echo chamber where you're talking about a million startups.
Yep.
And so you look at this stuff and someone's like, well, I'm different than this other startup. You take a look at, let's say, AI again is a very hot topic right now. I'm different than OpenAI because I do X and I have this extra feature, and you start building to a product differentiated to say OpenAI.
Yep.
Right? What you forget is that the average consumer in New York, the average consumer in Washington, D.C., the average consumer in Dallas, Texas, hasn't even adopted V1 yet. And if you came to somebody today with V10 of Facebook as the first thing they ever saw for a social network, you would be like, what the fuck is this? Right? And so remember that ability to get out of that echo chamber, and just remind yourself, where is the customer today? Right? Because again, it doesn't matter if some VC asks you, well, we looked at 3 other startups. Why are you differentiated from XYZ? It's it doesn't matter. It's why am I going to win this new customer better from where they are today? Right? And I think that was a very powerful lesson to hear, because they ended up, as you know, long story short, they crushed eBay in China.
It's actually interesting because if you look back, there was always a few big e-commerce players diving into different markets.
Yep.
And the two winners between Alibaba and Amazon in the US, both founders would tell you that they were just customer obsessed.
That's it. And it's such a cliche thing to say, but I think again, what does the takeaway mean? Like, yes, there are competitors, but if you always are building the competitors, it doesn't matter. It's just noise.
Yeah.
And by the way, you also should have no shame if a competitor does do something that your customers tell you about. Have no shame doing it too, because your customer wants it. Like, I don't want to copy these guys, or I don't want to replicate what they do. It's like, it doesn't matter. If that's what the customer demands, you find a way to create your version of it.
I agree with you. I mean, you mentioned something in this, which is just noise. And if I go back to when I was in college, I remember Kairos, which you had started. And I also feel like entrepreneurship was not cool when we were in college.
No.
It was like a thing where like we were like sitting in between class doing emails and trying to like, launch our own businesses, where now between the social network and other things, it got sexy. Why did you want to bring people together at such a young age back then?
So again, I think every crisis is an opportunity. Remember, I started Penn right as the financial crisis was hitting. And so I'm not even sure that it was like I wanted to go do entrepreneurial stuff or whatever, but all of a sudden the entire financial system broke. I mean, it's like there's parallels here, obviously, right? But people were suddenly coming, all the seniors, I was coming as an incoming freshman, coming into graduation, nobody had jobs, right? And so it was like, well, am I really going to spend my time betting on like going to work at a big company and then figuring stuff out, when you've got all these smart people who are now like, who knows where this market's going? So back to like entrepreneurship out of necessity, that's a really cool opportunity. Got a bunch of smart people with no jobs, with a lot of talent. To your point about social networks, Facebook was just kind of like really blowing up. There's this focus on dorm room startups that was starting to percolate. What if there's a way for us to tap into that and have the smartest people start building companies together, right? And one opportunity just led to another.
And you ended up starting a company in college, right? The bicycle company?
Well, no, that was actually some of my best friends from the Kairos network. I mean, we incubated so many fun companies in college. We were through Kairos. I was very lucky to meet some of the, I mean, to this day, I mean, many of the guys you still work with, many of the girls you still work with, they're just, these founders we were all in this together, 2008 through 2012, just all in college, building companies together, starting stuff. The bicycle company was two of my best friends they were at USC at the time. And we had guys, Neil Parikh started Casper, and he was at the time he was working on a clean water company with us in college. And my other buddy, Kayvon, who was part of the Stanford group, started this thing called Periscope while we were in school, which sold to Twitter. We had it was just such a fun, exciting time because, again, the world broke. And so all of a sudden there was that freedom, that opportunity cost that everybody felt like they had to pursue because you need to make money. You need to go into that job. How can you say no? Like, that job disappeared.
I feel like it was a shared mindset, There was just a few kids on every campus that saw this big opportunity. Facebook was blowing up,
Totally.
CACs were cheap. But as
And
part
the
of
iPhone
that,
had just launched.
the iPhone had just launched. Yeah, I mean, the Razr phones were pretty cool, but the iPhone was much better.
I was still a BlackBerry guy.
I heard you were a big fan of Peter's laws back in the day. Are those mottos that you still live by, or are there mottos you live by?
Yeah, I mean, I love so again, so many amazing people I've had a chance to spend time with over the years, and one of them is Peter Diamandis, who's just, you talk about big thinker. He likes to think big, which I love. You talk about nothing is impossible. I mean, he wanted his origin story, if you will. He always wanted to be an astronaut. He realized he was never going to be qualified because of some health issues to be a NASA astronaut. So he spent his career figuring out how to build a private space sector. And it's because of Peter and the X Prize Foundation that we have private spaceflight today, right? So Peter had a really fun set of kind of, memes that he would live by, some of which I have adopted. But I'd say probably my favorite one was do things by the book, just be the author. And the reason that's important, I think I appreciated the second part, but not the first part. when I first heard it. The idea of being the author sounds awesome. Do your own thing. I think it's what we realize quickly in the startup world is doing things by the book, quote unquote, really just means like across any business you work in, a lot of industries, they need their box. And I think where a lot of startups fail is they try to pitch something so revolutionary that people don't know how to box it.
Yep.
Right? Bilt is a loyalty program. People know how to box it, but for your home and neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
Why it's different. I remember when I was starting Human, we were trying to rebuild the contacts app on your mobile device. It's my first startup out of college. And I was so determined to, like, the iPhone had like their different apps, and one of them was called the phone. And they had removed this idea of contacts and made it the phone. And I was so determined to describe this as we are the modern phone app, right? And it was a mistake because that was not yet a box in people's minds, right? And someone said to me, they go, Facebook was not a social network when it started. Facebook was a website to share photos with friends. And the box people understood was website. What made it different was photos of friends. Eventually that became a new category. And then there was a new box. And then people could say, Snapchat could say it was a social network, but disappearing, right? And I think I had really underestimated, even really until like halfway through Bilt, how important it was to fit in the boxes. The reason we got our bank deal done is because we were able to fit this into a box they understood. Loyalty program with distribution and rewards currency, right?
Everyone has their mental models.
And it's not because they're not smart enough to think outside the box or from a different box, whatever. It's that at the end of the day, their incentives are aligned to that box.
Yeah.
And, I even think like I would go back and I would pitch these big companies on this cross-functional business value. But you forget that at the end of the day, the day-to-day teams are incentivized by their P&L. And it sounds crazy, but at a real estate, business even, the person responsible for leasing is a little different than the person responsible for ancillary revenue. And so if you can't talk to each person's box, like the tech person just wants to make sure it works. They're not necessarily incentivized by ancillary revenue.
I mean, now I think people will realize why when VCs are helping founders put together their pitch decks, they're like, oh, you're this or you're that.
Totally.
It's because of exactly what you're talking about.
And look, you will evolve that box, and it's important for you to have that vision for how it evolves, right? But it's really tough for people. And by the way, we also, I think, fell victim a little bit to this at Bilt in the early days. Like, we didn't communicate. We talked about rewards on rent and points on rent. We didn't give it a box. And so the market started thinking, oh, well, it's a credit card. Less than 15% of our users have the credit card. It's a great program.
Yeah.
But they boxed it for us. And so we had to spend a lot of time re-educating the market on actually our box is a loyalty program, right? Like your Sky Miles, United Mileage Plus, and your Marriott Bonvoy for your hotels, and Bilt is your loyalty program for your home and neighborhood.
I think if people want to dive more into that, they should read How Innovation Works. Like Bill Gurley recommends it. And it talks a lot about how a lot of the biggest innovations are just very additive, over time.
Yeah, it's you got to have the again North Star for how it drives fundamental shift, and you always have to have the customer problem from day one. But it is again something too new. People don't know what to make of it.
Yeah. Last two questions, then I gotta let you run. Apparently, you don't like setting goals or believe in setting goals. Why is that?
I'm a big believer as an individual in having purpose, not goals, right? What's your North Star? Because if I told you that the goal in the early days was to, maybe we had a goal around signing up co-brand cardholders, right? Everybody would have been so obsessed over that goal, we would have missed the much bigger opportunity on the payment side of being a platform for all banks, right? But the North Star is saying the purpose was how do we reward people on rent, right? Allowed us that flexibility to think about things in slightly different ways. So I think that I see this at big companies where they start to set these OKRs or goals or whatever, but then it creates such rigidity in their teams that anything outside of that, people say no and they miss so much bigger opportunities. So we're really clear on what is the like purpose of what we want to accomplish in this phase of our business. And so we run our business in chapters. Every phase of our company, I'll set out a very clear chapter. And what is the objectives in terms of the strategy, the strategic outcomes that we want to achieve versus like these fake KPIs.
Yeah.
Right. And we need to make sure that before we move on to chapter 2, like, for example, we need to figure out figure out the alignment of interest between us and our travel partners, right? That needs to happen during this phase of our business. What are all the ways that we could do that? Now, the easy one would have been like, just drive transfer volume. Drive just short-term transfer. What we realized is we can provide so much more revenue to these partners and be so much more aligned, because as we were working through that chapter, we realized that their co-brand cards can benefit from our platform, right? And so now you have, like I said, the Alaska Airlines card benefiting. You have 3 other major airlines this year rolling that program out. That can drive even more revenue to that partner than all of the transfer we do, and is directly aligned with their goals. But again, it was about setting a very clear strategic outcome, not these like bullshit KPI numbers. And if you're really disciplined about being defined in those, and we always laid out for every chapter, what are the strategic outcomes? What is the foundation work? What is the defensive work we have to do? What is the offensive work we have to do? And we can go chapter by chapter, and I can show you, and it's like almost every single one, we found creative new ways to achieve that chapter goals, if you will, if you call it a goal.
Yeah. It's the Ankur Jain master plan.
It's just a different, look, as you're building the story of the business and every phase of the company, you have a slightly different strategic thing you have to achieve. That is not necessarily a specific number you're trying to hit.
That makes total sense to me. All right, last question, going to master plan. And I feel like you are a big fan of giving back. I ask this to everybody. If you were mayor of New York City, what's a change that you would make tomorrow?
I'd say that everybody who bailed on New York during COVID should have to pay a fee to move back. And I think you should reinforce that loyalty to the city matters.
That is definitely the best answer, by the way, anyone's given so far. So I love that.
I'm a big diehard New Yorker. We were here in the office 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. We would not have been able to build this business if it wasn't for New York and all the different industries and talent and people that come together in this city. I'm a huge proponent of New York for startups.
It's an incredible melting pot.
So
thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.